Before sunrise, 2,000 Viet Cong soldiers moved through the dark jungle. Their target? A small hill with just 20 Americans and 120 South Vietnamese troops. What happened next became one of the most intense and overlooked battles of the Vietnam War. This is the story of the Battle of Sông Bé, a battle that tested courage, skill, and raw survival. A battle that started with a surprise attack and ended with hand-to-hand combat in the streets. Most people have never heard of Sông Bé, but in May 1965, it was nearly wiped off the map. The Viet Cong launched a massive surprise assault on this remote provincial capital, hoping to raise their flag and hold the town. For a few hours, they succeeded, but the defenders didn't break. Outnumbered more than 10 to 1, a handful of U.S. Special Forces soldiers, South Vietnamese Rangers, and a few local tanks held their ground. They didn't just survive. They fought back, retook the town, and sent the enemy fleeing into the jungle. In this video, we'll break down how it happened, the tactics, the bravery, and the aftermath. You'll see how a forgotten battle helped shape the future of the entire Vietnam War. If you enjoy stories of true courage, battlefield history, and military strategy, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. In early 1965, the Vietnam War was changing. The Viet Cong were growing bolder. These communist fighters had already won major battles in the countryside. In places like Viet Cong, they had defeated well-trained South Vietnamese forces. They weren't just ambushing patrols anymore. They were launching full-scale attacks, sometimes with thousands of soldiers. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese army, known as the ARVN, was struggling. Corruption, poor leadership, and low morale had weakened their fighting power. Some soldiers deserted, others didn't trust their commanders. It was a dangerous time. America was watching closely. At this point, the United States had not yet fully entered the war with combat troops, but they had sent thousands of advisors, pilots, and special forces. These Americans trained and supported the South Vietnamese, hoping to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. One of those remote areas was Phuoc Long Province, near the Cambodian border. Its capital was a small, quiet town called Sông Bé. It had dirt roads, a market, and a small military outpost. It wasn't famous. It wasn't even that well defended, but the Viet Cong saw it as the perfect target. In April 1965, a team of U.S. Green Berets from Special Forces Detachment B-34 arrived in Sông Bé. They joined a handful of American advisors already working with local ARVN forces. Together, they began building a fortified camp on a small hill overlooking the town. Sandbags, bunkers, barbed wire. They were preparing for something, and they were right to. Unbeknownst to them, 2 full Viet Cong regiments were already moving into position. They were planning a massive assault to capture the town, kill the defenders, and send a clear message. No place in South Vietnam was safe. This wasn't going to be a small firefight in the jungle. This was going to be a battle. It was still dark when the first mortar shells fell on Sông Bé. The time was 1:45 in the morning, May 10th, 1965. The defenders had no warning, no radio call, no scout reports, just silence, then explosions. The Viet Cong had arrived, and they didn't come quietly. Over 2,000 communist fighters from the 271st and 272nd Regiments had surrounded the town. They were well armed with mortars, flamethrowers, and heavy machine guns. They had trained for this assault and knew exactly where to strike. Their plan was brutal and simple: hit hard, hit fast, and overwhelm the defenders before sunrise. Mortar rounds slammed into the ARVN outpost and the American Special Forces camp on the hill. Then came the small arms fire, machine guns, AK-47s, and even RPGs. Sappers, Viet Cong combat engineers, crawled through the wire, carrying explosives to blow open the perimeter. Inside the hilltop compound, about 20 Green Berets and U.S. Army advisors held their ground with 120 South Vietnamese troops, local militia, regional forces, and a few aging M24 tanks. They were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. The defenders scrambled into their bunkers and returned fire with everything they had. Light machine guns rattled from behind sandbags. Flares lit up the night sky. Tracers painted red lines across the jungle. At one point, Viet Cong fighters reached the outer bunkers. The battle became close and personal. Rifles at 10 feet, grenades thrown over walls, some soldiers even fighting hand-to-hand. Inside the town below, it was worse. The Viet Cong swept through the streets, capturing buildings, destroying communication posts, and pushing local defenders out. They raised their flag over government buildings, a chilling symbol that they had taken Sông Bé. For several hours, it looked like they had won, but the hill still held. The American-led compound just outside the town refused to fall. Special Forces soldiers like Staff Sergeant Horace Young and SP4 Johnny Culbreth fought fiercely, calling in fire support, coordinating defenses, and refusing to leave their posts. As dawn approached, the defenders were running low on ammunition, but they still had control of the hill. And with daylight came something the Viet Cong feared: American air power. The battle for Sông Bé was far from over. In fact, it was about to turn. As the sun began to rise over Sông Bé, the jungle fog still clung to the ground. Smoke from burning buildings drifted across the town. The smell of gunpowder was everywhere. But with daylight came new hope. American helicopter gunships, the famous Hueys, were now airborne. They circled above the town, ready to fire rockets and machine guns at the enemy below. But there was a problem. Thick fog and low clouds made it hard to see anything. The pilots couldn't tell who was friendly and who was Viet Cong. Down below, the defenders were still locked in combat. The Green Berets and ARVN troops on the hill were holding out, but barely. Ammunition was running low. Medics worked nonstop. The wounded were piling up, and helicopters couldn't land under enemy fire. Then the situation got worse. The Viet Cong had placed 50 caliber machine guns around the town, powerful enough to shoot down helicopters. Every time a medevac tried to land, those guns opened fire. Several choppers were forced to pull away. It was time to bring in the big guns. By late morning, the fog finally began to lift. That's when U.S. Air Force F-4 Phantoms arrived overhead. These jets were fast, loud, and deadly. With the help of American advisors on the ground, the Phantoms dropped cluster bombs directly onto the enemy gun positions. The explosions were massive. Whole sections of enemy fire went silent. One by one, the .50 caliber nests were destroyed. Now at last, helicopters could land. They evacuated the wounded and dropped off fresh ammunition. The tide was beginning to turn, but retaking the town wouldn't be easy. The Viet Cong still controlled most of Sông Bé, and they weren't going to give it up without a fight. That job would fall to South Vietnam's toughest warriors, the ARVN Rangers. The counterattack. At noon on May 10th, while smoke still rose from the town, the ground began to shake again. But this time, it wasn't the Viet Cong. It was the sound of ARVN Ranger boots hitting the ground. The 36th Ranger Battalion, South Vietnam's elite light infantry, had arrived. These weren't ordinary troops. They were trained for jungle warfare, raids, and brutal combat. Their job was simple: take back Sông Bé. And they didn't waste a second. Instead of setting up slowly or waiting for reinforcements, the Rangers launched an immediate assault in broad daylight. They charged straight into the burning town from the south, pushing through ruined buildings and streets still crawling with Viet Cong. The Viet Cong weren't expecting this. They had just fought all night. Now they were facing an elite force coming at them fast, with guns blazing. The Rangers fought house to house, room to room. Grenades were thrown through windows. Rifle fire echoed down alleys. The streets became a maze of smoke, gunfire, and screams. In many places, the battle was so close that soldiers couldn't use their rifles. Some Rangers drew knives, machetes, even their bare hands. One South Vietnamese sergeant was seen leading his squad with a traditional combat blade, slashing through a wall to get to a hidden VC fighter. Another platoon cleared an entire building in less than 5 minutes, kicking down doors and dragging out enemy soldiers. As the 36th Rangers pushed through the center of town, a second elite unit arrived from the east, the 34th Ranger Battalion. Together, the two battalions launched a two-sided sweep, closing in on remaining enemy pockets and trapping them inside burning buildings and courtyards. It was chaos, but it was working. The Rangers moved like fire. They retook government buildings, destroyed enemy machine gun nests, and rescued trapped civilians. By nightfall, the Viet Cong knew they couldn't hold the town. What was supposed to be a quick victory had turned into a disaster for them. Their plan to capture Sông Bé had failed. Now they were trying to escape. Many fled into the jungle under cover of darkness. Others were killed in the streets. Some left behind weapons and even wounded comrades. They couldn't afford to stay. By the end of the day, Sông Bé was back in ARVN hands. The town was damaged. Fires still burned, but the flag had been lowered, and the people for now were safe. The Rangers had done what few thought possible. They had taken back a lost town through sheer speed, force, and courage, and they weren't done yet. The next morning, they would begin the hunt. The next morning, May 11th, the smoke still hung low over Sông Bé. The battle was over, but the war in the area was not. The ARVN Rangers and local forces began sweeping the town and nearby jungle. They were looking for hidden Viet Cong fighters, recovering weapons, and checking for booby traps left behind. What they found was destruction. Blown-out buildings, burnt homes, and the bodies of both friend and foe. In and around the town, 85 Viet Cong were confirmed killed. Many more were believed wounded, but most had escaped into the dense jungle. Despite their heavy losses, the VC had managed to retreat in an organized way, proof of their discipline and training. Over the next 4 days, from May 11th to 15th, ARVN troops pushed outward, trying to track and destroy the retreating enemy. But the terrain was on the VC side. Thick forests, hidden trails, and the nearby Cambodian border made pursuit nearly impossible. On May 15th, just as the ARVN thought things were calming down, a Viet Cong ambush struck an ARVN convoy outside the town. Several soldiers were killed and vehicles were destroyed. It was a final act of defiance from an enemy that refused to vanish quietly. When the dust finally settled, the numbers told the story. The ARVN had lost 49 soldiers. The United States lost 5. Brave special forces and advisors who fought to the very end. Sông Bé had survived, but the battle left deep scars, physical and emotional, on the soldiers and civilians who lived through it. And while the enemy had been pushed back, they were far from finished. In fact, they were already planning their next move. Behind the maps and strategies, the Battle of Sông Bé was also a story of human bravery, of men who stood their ground when everything around them was falling apart. One of those men was Captain Henry Deutsch, a U.S. Army advisor with the MACV team. When the attack began, Deutsch could have evacuated, but he refused. He stayed with his South Vietnamese allies, helping coordinate airstrikes and rally troops inside the burning town. According to survivors, he radioed in targets even as bullets snapped past his head. He was later killed by shrapnel during the fighting. For his actions, he was posthumously awarded the Silver Star. But to the men around him, he was more than a medal. He was a leader who refused to leave his post. On the hilltop, Special Forces Staff Sergeant Horace Young and SP4 Johnny Colbreth were among the first to fall. They were inside the fortified camp, directing defensive fire and manning radios as the enemy closed in. Young was hit by a mortar round, still at his station. Colbreth went down fighting in the dark. Both were remembered as calm under fire, brave to the end. The ARVN Rangers, too, wrote their own legend that day. These weren't conscripts or inexperienced soldiers. They were elite, and they fought like it. Some used knives and machetes in hand-to-hand combat, storming buildings filled with enemy fighters. One Ranger officer was said to carry a traditional Vietnamese blade into combat, leading the charge through smoke-filled alleys. There were also civilians, families who hid in basements or ditches through the night. One 12-year-old girl later said her family prayed the Rangers would come. When they did, they helped lead survivors to safety, even as bullets still flew overhead. After the battle, the Green Berets nicknamed their camp Little Dien Bien Phu. It was a nod to the famous French battle, but with a twist. This time, the defenders had won. These stories didn't make headlines. They weren't turned into movies, but for those who lived them, they were unforgettable. Sông Bé wasn't just a battle, it was a stand. The Battle of Sông Bé wasn't just a story of bravery. It was also a clear example of how both sides adapted, planned, and executed modern warfare in Vietnam. The Viet Cong used classic guerrilla tactics, but on a much larger scale. They weren't just harassing patrols or planting roadside bombs. This time, they committed 2 full regiments, over 2,000 fighters, to a direct assault on a provincial capital. That alone showed how bold and organized they had become by 1965. Their strategy was called hit the point, destroy the reinforcements. It meant attacking a key target, like Sông Bé, and preparing ambushes to crush any counterattack. They used sappers to break through defenses, mortars to soften targets, and flamethrowers to clear buildings. They also placed .50 caliber machine guns in strategic spots to shoot down helicopters, something U.S. forces were relying on more and more. The plan nearly worked, but what stopped them was a combination of defensive preparation, air power, and elite counterattack forces. The Special Forces camp on the hill, built just weeks before, proved its value. With bunkers, barbed wire, and clear fields of fire, a small force of Americans and ARVN troops held off thousands. It bought time, and in Vietnam, time meant air support. When the fog cleared, U.S. jets and helicopters took control of the skies. Cluster bombs destroyed key enemy positions. Once the .50 cal guns were neutralized, helicopters could land, and the tide began to turn. The most decisive move came from the ARVN Rangers. These elite troops didn't wait. They attacked the town in daylight, using speed and aggression to surprise the Viet Cong. They fought up close, often room to room, using rifles, grenades, and sometimes even knives. What didn't work was pursuit. The Viet Cong escaped into the jungle in small groups, avoiding total destruction. This exposed a weakness in ARVN operations. They couldn't track or fight effectively at night. That failure led to a big change. After Sông Bé, the U.S. created new MIKE forces. After months of setbacks and low morale, South Vietnamese Rangers showed that, with good leadership and proper support, they could take the fight to the enemy and win. Their quick counterattack, close quarters fighting, and refusal to back down became a source of pride. For the United States, the battle exposed both strengths and weaknesses. The combination of special forces, air power, and elite ARVN units worked. But the inability to stop the enemy from escaping showed a serious gap in strategy, especially at night. That led directly to the formation of MIKE forces, special mobile strike teams created to respond faster and chase down retreating enemies. Politically, Sông Bé was a small but important moment. It reassured leaders in Saigon and Washington that South Vietnam still had fight left in it, but it also showed how fast the war was escalating. And there's a tragic twist to this story. Exactly 10 years later, in 1975, Phuoc Long Province, including Sông Bé, was the first area to fall to the North Vietnamese in the final offensive. This time there were no U.S. forces, no air support, and no counterattack. In 1965, Sông Bé was saved. In 1975, it marked the beginning of the end. The Battle of Sông Bé was not the largest battle of the Vietnam War. It didn't involve thousands of American troops or make headlines around the world, but it mattered to the soldiers who fought it, to the commanders who studied it, and to the war that was just beginning to shift. It showed that the Viet Cong were willing to launch major attacks, not just disappear into the jungle. And it proved that with the right leadership, the South Vietnamese army could hit back hard. It was a battle where 20 Americans and 120 South Vietnamese held the line against thousands. It was a battle where men like Captain Henry Deutsch, SSG Horace Young, and the brave ARVN Rangers refused to give up their ground, even when surrounded, outnumbered, and under fire from all sides. It was a turning point. Sông Bé became a symbol, not just of defense, but of resilience. And even though it's rarely mentioned today, the lessons from that small town echoed throughout the war. Be ready, adapt fast, and never underestimate your enemy. If you found this story powerful, please like the video, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more forgotten moments from military history. Your support helps keep these stories alive. And as always, remember the names, honor the courage, and learn from the past. We'll see you in the next one.